Hi everyone, welcome to another video in the Let's Talk About It series. Today we will be having the same guest as last time actually, because this is the part 2 video of learning how to learn, and if you haven't watched part 1 already, then you can find the link somewhere on the screen. Without further ado, let's talk about it.
Coming to our next question, how to deal with imposter syndrome.
Now the interview is getting a little serious. We're turning towards the psychological basis of things. So for those listeners who do not know a lot about imposter syndrome, just Google it and it will give you a basic idea about what it is. And it actually belongs to one side of an entire spectrum, the other side of which is known as the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is a very interesting psychological phenomenon. Unfortunately, in a recent article, McGill University has tried their best to prove that it does not really exist and it was a statistical fallacy. But anyways, research is mostly about fighting with each other about science, so that's cool. But let's talk about imposter syndrome. So imposter syndrome is basically you underestimate yourself a lot. If you score well, you're like, it might just be luck, I'm sure I don't deserve that and stuff like that. And it's got its deeper roots in social and cultural conditioning, because oftentimes we are raised with the virtue that be humble, which is good, which is great. I'm not saying that that's bad, but we're raised with that thing that speaking too much about your achievements is not a good thing. That makes you like a show off. But to that I say, if you want to be seen in a world which moves at lightning speed, especially when it comes to the new attention span of the generation, which is really less, you have to kind of be a little loud about everything that you do. And I think imposter syndrome comes from the exact opposite of that, where you kind of tend to just underestimate yourself all the time, thinking that I'm not good enough. Now, it's a separate talk in itself, and I would not be the best person to speak about it because it does not come under the realm of my expertise. But I'll tell you one thing though, for a typical medical student, the biggest transition is going from 12th standard to a medical institute. So since I am exactly at the root of that transition, because I see a student who just passed her or his 12th standard come to me when I'm teaching them. And in 6 years of my teaching experience, what I realized could be an important cause for imposter syndrome is from being an achiever or an overachiever within your community, you are suddenly now exposed to a larger audience. So there could be another person who is an overachiever in their community, and there could be an actual intellectual spectrum between these two communities. Now, when I say community, I'll try to narrow it down by using something like language, for example. A very important part of a medical student, especially in the viva voce kind of question answer exams, is they have to be able to articulate what they know really well, right? And whenever articulation comes into question, language is very important. If somebody is not very good with the English language but is extremely brilliant, he or she might still have a problem in putting that out in that language, right? And then what will happen is that somebody else is probably doing it way better than them, because maybe they came from a school where elocution was an important aspect, and for them this was not. So maybe that also kind of leads to this whole inferiority complex kind of situation, where you kind of start really undermining yourself, thinking, I don't think, like, I can't speak the way she or he does, and wow, so brilliant. Like, I thought I was the smartest in my school, but hey, my eyes just opened up, the bubble just burst. And the best way to understand, let's not even use the word to solve it or to fight it back. Let's just use the word understand. The best way to understand why you feel a certain way, be it imposter syndrome or the other side of the spectrum, is to understand your brain better, which takes me to my previous line again, that it's about understanding your brain better from a very personal approach. Because once you start understanding your brain and you start understanding how people learn, you'll realize that a lot of the articulation and language expertise comes from the surroundings. So if you were in a convent school and you were surrounded by people who had to compulsorily speak in the English language. It was just something that made them uncomfortable initially if that was not their mother tongue, but they got really fluent with it. So now, no matter what they read, they might probably just remember 40% of it, but they can expel all of that 40% straight up in front of a teacher. So they're good at elocution. On the other hand, there could be somebody who's remembering 99% of everything that she or he is reading. Forgive me for saying she all the time, because for a year I've been teaching in a medical college for women, right? So it becomes a little bit, I have to kind of make an effort here. But moving on, if there's somebody who is having a problem with the language but is still extremely well at remembering things, he or she might be under the misillusion that she or he is not smart enough, which is false. So let us not confuse language and articulation, which comes from the prefrontal cortex of the brain, of course, all the association with the parietal and temporal areas. But let us not confuse that with the fact that you do not have an incredible memory. You are remembering 90%. You can't talk about it because of a problem in the whole Broca's, Wernicke's thing, whatever. Great. You can work on that. It does not make you any dumber than somebody else who's been doing it for a while. Once you start getting comfortable with the idea about how brain works and what are the roles of psychological and cultural conditioning in the way you learn, you can start being a little more kind to yourself, and that is important. You could probably tell yourself that this is something that I need to work on. Cool, bro. Maybe I'll watch more English TV shows. Maybe I'll listen to more English music. Maybe I'll try to talk a little more in English about anything and everything that I want to do. And it's definitely a life skill that will help me in my exams, because it's all conducted in English. Right, it's not in the mother tongue at all. So that is one thing that I can say about how to deal with not only imposter syndrome, but any disillusion or faulty interpretation or misjudgment about how smart you really are. I'm also going to link a very nice video by one of my most favorite philosophers, Alan de Botton. He's a damn cool guy. He has a YouTube channel called The School of Life, so maybe I'll also post that link. There's a video in which he talks about how people who go to like more high intellect schools like Harvard have more rates of dropping out as compared to a university which is not that like elite for its intellectualism, but apparently because of the lesser dropout rates, the overall long-term success of middle-rate universities is much more than the high-rated universities. You know, there are people in my university who say that I was good in 12th standard, then I had to take a draw, that took a hit on my confidence and all. To them, I say, you are taking a hit on your confidence because you have a very limited understanding of learning and intelligence. If you start expanding how intelligence works, how learning works, you'll gain the ability to be kind to yourself, and you'll also kind of understand your strengths and weaknesses and pay more attention to the latter. So I think that's one thing that I can talk about. I hope that answers your question, though. It's not exactly what you asked.
Yeah, that definitely does. I mean, that's really valuable insight on imposter syndrome, and I feel like everyone should develop their own way of dealing with it. It's such a recognizing that that's not end all, that you are not dumb than anyone.
Exactly.
Because of some.
I think group.
Yeah.
I think being in a group helps, and I always urge my students to have a group that has multiple cultural influences. If you're going to hang out with birds of the same feather flock, whatever, blah, blah, you're not really going to understand your weaknesses because you're sharing a common weakness, bro. So you guys are kind of tripping on the same things again and again, and everything else that does not work your way, you're going to have some kind of like a hard feeling towards that. Here comes the fancy English speaking group. No, bro. Get somebody in on your group. You know what? Let your group be the perfect mix of different cultures, because I understand it's a very 18-year-old thing to stick, and I completely get that. It's a very young age kind of a thing to try to find differences in people. And as you start growing older and wiser, you start finding what is similar between people, you know, and that kind of perspective probably should change very early on. So you kind of become a little more open-minded, and you have like, you know, a perfect ratio of extroversion and introversion in your group, of great articulation but great reception in one group. You know what I'm saying? Have like a healthy, eclectic mix of all these different strengths. So as a group, you stand out, and eventually you are what your surroundings are. So the conversation on the dinner table when no one is listening is just as important as a conversation in front of an examiner. People need to realize that.
Yeah, that's true. It's important to recognize your strengths and then work on your weaknesses. And that will be the best way to fight imposter syndrome, or if you recognize it.
I guess, yeah, in my opinion.
Coming to our next question, that is, what are your thoughts about the memory palace technique?
yeah, that's like a very interesting thing. It's again spoken a lot about in the same course that I spoke about earlier, learning how to learn. And in my honest opinion, from where I come from, understanding the amount of information that a medical student has to kind of remember, I think the mind palace per se won't work, but the mind palace is constructed on the basic concepts of association. So if you could associate one thing to the other, it just increases your ability to remember things better. I spoke earlier about like the shape of a chandelier, making you think of a histological structure that it looks like. This comes from an actual example where I was sitting with my students and we have this beautiful dinner place on the top of the hill, the university where I teach. And they've got these ellipsoidal chandeliers hanging all the way down. And I just asked them, they probably hate me for it, but I kind of asked them that, what structure does this remind you of? And I think they hadn't reached far across towards spleen histology yet. But an ellipsoid is a very interesting structure that is seen in the spleen, and it has a very cool evolutionary principle on which it works. The precapillary sphincter and all used to be very important for lower animals with high intravascular volume, like the horse. So in the horse, the precapillary sphincters of the spleen are very much active as opposed to humans. With evolution, we kind of did not need the need of that. So stuff like that. But what I'm saying is that, you know what I'm saying? I mean, you could still make it an evolutionary anatomy chapter while you're having dinner without it having to be a classroom environment. This is still a great conversation to have. And it's definitely insightful in understanding how the human, splenic system works. So I think association is good. In fact, I have a couple of images on a PowerPoint presentation. So if you can share that, I could just give a couple of examples that I used this year when I was teaching like HNF and neuroanatomy and stuff. Okay, so that's the first slide. And what you see on the screen is basically the lid of a deodorant, Axe deodorant. And it really reminds me of the circumvallate papilla for some strange reason. Because if you observe the circumvallate papilla, when you see it in like a two-dimensional diagram, it does not make as much sense, but it's actually a circular thing with a gutter around it, right? So that's something that I presented in my lecture on tongue when we were speaking about the circumvallate papilla. The next one that you see is actually an opening slide of my lecture on rectum. And if you look at the rectum in a sagittal section, it reminds me of Michael Jackson doing that famous move. I tell my students that the anorectal sling, which is kind of formed by a muscle called puborectalis, is going around his knee caps and pulling his knees ahead. So that's where basically the rectoanal flexure or anorectal flexure is. Everything below that is the anal canal. So that's something that I kind of use. In the next slide, you can actually see a cerebellum, but it's an opening slide where I'm holding an oyster. And whenever you look at the diagram of a cerebellum, there are two diagrams, one below the other. So it's being opened like you would open an oyster. So that's one thing that I used. The next one is actually a TV show reference, because I love TV shows. Like my idea of success is to be able to like sleep on your own bed by 9 p.m. watching like your favorite TV show. So this is Game of Thrones. Unfortunately, this did not work for most of my students because most of them haven't seen GOT yet. So yeah, next time I should use references that are more relatable for the younger ones. But in GOT, like on the left side, you have, I forgot the name of the queen, but Marjorie, I think so, Marjorie. Queen Marjorie is like, chilling with the king in the bedroom one-on-one, and she gets to influence him directly like that. So that is basically the equivalent of what are known as climbing fibers. She also kind of climbs on him. In a way. So I thought that would be a great reference for remembering climbing fibers. On the other side, you see an entire table like a panel discussion, and that is the Morse fibers. The Morse fibers have a number of interneurons, and most of them are negative or inhibitory interneurons, as you can see from each of these characters, except the mother, who's a positive influence on the young king, Joffrey. So the mother is actually the granule cell, because that is the only one cell in the interneuronal circuitry of the cerebellum that gives you a positive kind of an output. Everything else is a negative output. So I try to involve these things. So somebody who's really a GOT fan is suddenly like, oh my God, done. I like this. This is some kind of an association that I will not forget. So I kind of tend to do that. The last one that I'm going to show you is actually the Batman and the Batmobile. So when I was teaching the third ventricle, I told them to assume that the third ventricle is the Batmobile, and Batman sitting on that is actually the fornix. The hands of the Batman on the accelerator and the brakes or whatever becomes the anterior aspect of the fornix, the columns. They are known as the columns of the fornix, while the posterior part, or if you trace the arc behind, then the shoes of the Batman will actually be the hippocampus. And I kind of try to make it as hilarious as possible, because the more hilarious it is, I think it works better for me. So if you look at the commissural fibers at the posterior aspect, tell them that it's Batman wearing a pair of really tight pants, and the tight pants are actually almost tearing apart. So if you observe the commissural fibers connecting the crura of the fornix, it actually looks like a pant that's about to be stretched and torn. And then to just give them a little more deeper perspective of the lateral ventricle, I told them to imagine that the lateral ventricle is the cape or the cloak or whatever you call it of Batman, which is flying away, right? So the lateral ventricle is kind of related to the fornix, just like Batman's cape would be on either side. So I try to keep these things involve people's imagination and association. And my tip to all people who are watching the video is you need to come up with your own things like that, because if somebody is putting it on a silver platter for you, you're not really thinking and you're not testing your creative skills and your imagination. And the number one thing about learning, and the number one marker of intelligence, is how nicely you can imagine, how much is your creative insight. And it's an exercise. You need to exercise that creative muscle. How are you going to do that? Whenever you're looking at a picture, whenever you're looking at a photo, a table, try to think of what you can associate with. It could be outrageous, but it will work for you. And you know what? When you're done with that, go to your friends and tell them about that same association. Let them have a laugh about it, or be like, gross, what's wrong with you, or whatever. That's cool. But as long as something is remembered and associated by you and then spoken about later, you're making an even stronger connection now. So I think if you want to learn better, stick to associating things that are relatable with you and your friends. That's definitely one of the things that are important according to me.
I guess that sums up Memory Palace in your thoughts about it. And I think Memory Palace works for some, doesn't work for most people, or at least till they practice it. But association is something we have been practicing from, I think, childhood. We like to associate things and relate to it. So coming to our next and final question, that is, tell us a little bit about your PhD topic.
Yeah. So I'm sure most of you might have figured it by now that I'm not exactly an academician. I finished my MBA in Human Anatomy in 2017, and then I went to Bombay to chase the musical dream. So I was still working there as a tutor, and I did take a few lectures, but I was really concentrating on writing my own music, recording it, and performing it live. Then I came back 2 years down the lane thinking that I want to do something that is more of a scientist kind of an approach towards music. So that's when I stumbled upon this topic, that is the use of binaural frequencies to enhance learning, to enhance retention and memory and stuff like that. So my PhD page, I can't really speak much about it right now because it's in a very nascent stage, but it basically involves the use of music that is engineered precisely to have an element of binaurality in it. You'll have to probably read about that. So I'll just post a link of a paper that you can check out from the description. So binaural frequencies, and it's actually on YouTube also. There's a lot of binaural music on YouTube right now. So you could give it a shot. I don't know how scientifically appropriate it is when they've made it, but what we're trying to do is come up with a more sophisticated, professional beta binaural music that would be coupled with my online lectures. So people who are listening to the lectures actually have the binaural experience, and that probably helps them to remember better. But like I said, I don't want to give in too much right now because it's in the nascent stage, but I'm definitely sure that I can keep everybody posted about it if you end up following me on my channel. So it's also a nice little sneaky way to have people follow me. But I think it's cool, and I think you should definitely check out some of the things that I talk about and some of the things that I post on my Instagram stories, because it will definitely make you think. And I think one of the most important things that the education system is lacking and needs, especially in terms of medical education, is forcing the students to think, to imagine, and to create.
Yeah, that's such a innovative and out of the box topic. I think to combine your passions, I guess, both music and medicine, and come up with something so great. So looking forward to you completing your PhD and seeing more papers in your name about the topic. So, I think that brings us to the end of our session, and lovely to have you with us today. And anything you'd like to say, anything you'd like to give, any inputs for our audience?
Yeah, I'll just quickly like to summarize the session so that everybody has something to take back home. So first we started off by talking about learning, and instead of sticking to the Google definition of learning, I came up with this philosophy of 5 R's that are important for a medical education learner, right? So the first one was repetition. The second one was relating and association, basically. The third one was routine. The fourth one was rationalism, and the fifth one was reflection. And the second question, we kind of spoke about rote learning and how it is an important component of medical education, unfortunately, and it should not be seen in a bad light. I used the example of differential diagnosis of splenomegaly for the same. The next thing, we spoke about procrastination, maintaining consistency, and fighting burnout. So in the procrastination bit, I spoke a little bit about Pomodoro. You can read more about it. For maintaining consistency, I spoke about having a reward at the end of your focused thinking or Pomodoro sessions. And I also spoke about falling in love with the process more than the product, trying to, keep it creative so that you look forward to doing it again. And then fighting the burnouts, I kind of spoke about how to identify burnout, how to tweak your life according to understanding your brain better so your schedule matches with the burnout sessions in such a way that on maximum productive days you do the most difficult things. I also spoke about other things to fight off a burnout, which essentially was to wait, be patient, go into an alternate universe through TV shows or intellectual conversations with people from other disciplines. We spoke about exercise, we spoke about TV shows, and we spoke about sleep. In question number 4, we spoke a little bit about imposter syndrome, and though I'm not the expert to talk about it, I kind of gave an example of a relatable example of somebody about why they would feel a little dumb when they suddenly used to be toppers back in school, and how to understand the cultural conditioning and the social conditioning and how the brain works and what is language and articulation to help them understand themselves better and not be in the illusion that they're not smart enough. And the last thing was basically memory palace technique, but we visited association more, and I give you a couple of examples from my own lectures. For association,
Thank you, sir. That's such a wonderful session and so interactive, so much information. And I learned a lot, and I hope our audience will enjoy this session as well. Thank you.
I hope so. All right. Thank you for having me. Cheers, guys.